Welcome to Deep Thinkers. Tonight I want you to picture a forest, not a forest you have ever walked through and not one anyone alive has ever seen, because the last of these trees fell more than 300 million years ago, long before there was anyone here to watch them fall. But picture it anyway. Picture the trunks first. They rise out of black waterlogged ground and they go up and up past where you would expect a tree to stop, past the height of a house, past the height of a 6-story building, 30 meters and more, into a hazy, heavy sky. Some of them, by the highest estimates, may have reached close to 50 meters. And the strangest thing, the thing I want to sit with you for a long, slow while tonight, is that these towering trees were not held up by wood. They were held up, more than anything, by their own bark. Let that settle for a moment. A forest of giants, taller than almost anything you would call a tree today. And the secret of how they stood was not the hard heartwood we imagine when we think of a great trunk. It was the rind, the skin, the outer shell. And inside that shell, where you would expect dense, solid timber, there was something far softer, almost spongy, threaded through with only a thin strand of the tissue that carried water up from the roots. These were trees that wore their strength on the outside like armor and kept something tender within. Before we go any deeper into those trees, let me do the small, gentle thing this channel always does at the start of a long night. If you feel like it, tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. Somewhere out there, in a city or a quiet house at the edge of nowhere. You are lying in the dark while I talk about forests that turned to stone. And I find that a lovely thought, you and I sharing the same slow hour from opposite ends of the planet. Leave it in the comments if you like. No rush, whenever you wake or whenever you drift. And if you are new here and you think you might want more nights like this one, you can subscribe softly, and the next slow story will find you. That is all. No more interruptions. From here we go down into the swamp together, slowly, and we are not in any hurry to come out. Because that is the promise of tonight. We are going to walk very slowly into one of the strangest chapters in the whole history of this planet, and we are going to walk into it from a direction most people never take. Usually when anyone tells this story, they tell it from the side of the monsters, the giant insects, the dragonfly the size of a hawk, the millipede the length of a car. And we will get to them, I promise you, but not yet, and not as the heroes. Tonight, the heroes are the trees, the forests themselves, because everything strange and enormous that crawled and flew through this world was, in the end, a consequence of what the plants were quietly doing to the air. The forests came first. The forests were the engine, and if you only ever look at the giant bugs, you miss the much larger, much stranger machine that built them. So let the bugs wait in the wings. Let us look at the trees. The time we are walking into has a name. We call it the Carboniferous. It is a stretch of deep time that runs from roughly 359 million years ago to about 299 million years ago. That is 60 million years, give or take, and I want you to notice how the mind simply slides off a number like that. You cannot really hold 60 million years in your head. You can hold a summer, you can hold a single long night, perhaps like this one. But 60 million years is so much time that the forests we are talking about did not last a moment in geological terms. They were the world for an age, the way the sky is the world to a bird. Generations of trees beyond counting, growing, dying, falling, growing again, for a span of time so long that the human story, all of it, every king and city and war and song, would fit inside a thin sliver of it and disappear. The name itself, Carboniferous, is younger than the trees by an almost comic margin. It was given to this period only in the year 1822 by two men, William Conybeare and William Phillips, who were trying to make sense of the rock beneath Britain. They saw, layered through the stone, vast dark seams of coal, and they named the whole age for it. Carboniferous, carbon-bearing, the age that carried coal. They had no idea, not really, what they were naming. They were two men with notebooks looking at black bands in grey rock, and they reached for a Latin root that meant coal-carrying, and the name stuck. We will come back to that coal much later tonight, because it turns out to be the whole point, the very thread that ties these ancient forests to the world outside your window. But for now, just hold the name gently, Carboniferous, the coal-bearing age. And know that you are walking into the place where all the coal humanity has ever burned was quietly being made, leaf by leaf, trunk by falling trunk. Sometimes you will hear the Carboniferous split into two halves, and the names are worth knowing if only for their music. In North American usage, the earlier half is called the Mississippian, and the later half is called the Pennsylvanian. The Mississippian first, the older world, then the Pennsylvanian, when the great coal swamps reached their fullest, lushest, most teeming expression. Two long acts of one even longer play. You do not need to remember which is which to fall asleep tonight. I only mention it so that if the words drift past you in the dark, they feel like old friends rather than strangers. And the land itself in those days was not arranged the way it is now. The continents you know, the familiar shapes on every map, did not exist as separate things. They were drifting together, slowly, the way everything in this story happens slowly, gathering into one vast supercontinent that we call Pangaea. And Pangaea straddled the equator. So a great band of this single, enormous landmass lay right across the warmest, wettest belt of the planet, soaking in heat and rain, year after year, age after age. That matters more than I can say right now, and we will return to why it matters. For tonight, just hold the picture. One huge continent lying across the middle of the world like a sleeping animal, and along its low, drowned equatorial edges, the swamps. The endless, steaming green-black swamps. And in the swamps, the trees. Now let me show you the trees properly, because they deserve it, and because the closer you look at them, the stranger and more wonderful they become. The giants of these forests had names that sound like incantations. The two you should carry into sleep tonight are Lepidodendron and Sigillaria. Say them slowly to yourself if you like. Lepidodendron, Sigillaria. They were the great trunks of the coal swamps, the towers I described at the beginning, and they belonged to a group of plants called Lycophytes. And here is the first quiet surprise of the night, the kind of fact that rearranges how you see the world. These towering Lycophytes, these trees taller than a 6-story building, were not related to the great trees we know today. They were not ancestors of the oak or the pine. They were giant relatives of something very small. They were the giant cousins of the club mosses. The little ground creeping plants, the ones you might step over on a forest floor without a second glance, the ones rarely more than a few centimeters or at most a few handspans tall. Those small, humble, easily overlooked plants are the living descendants of these vanished giants. The lineage that once built 30-meter forests now creeps along the ground, ankle-high in the shade of trees that came much, much later. I find that almost unbearably beautiful, and we will sit with it again at the end of our long journey, but I wanted to plant the seed of it now, here, at the beginning, so that it can grow quietly in the back of your mind as you drift. These trees have another name, an older, more poetic one, given to them by the people who first found their fossils. They are called the scale trees, and the reason is this: the trunks of Lepidodendron and Sigillaria were covered all over in a pattern. Not bark in the rough, plated way you might picture an old oak, but a regular, repeating geometry of marks, diamond-shaped or hexagon-shaped, packed neatly together up and down the whole length of the trunk, like the scales of some enormous reptile. These marks were leaf scars. Each diamond was the place where a long, slender leaf had once attached to the trunk, and when the leaf fell away, as the tree grew taller and shed its lower foliage, it left behind this perfect little geometric scar. And so the whole trunk became a record of every leaf it had ever held, a diamond pattern climbing skyward, a kind of writing in the bark. The pattern was so clean, so regular, so strikingly like the skin of a great serpent or a lizard, that the early fossil collectors who found these trunks in stone made an honest and rather lovely mistake. They thought they had found the fossilized skin of some monstrous reptile or snake. Imagine being one of those collectors holding a long curved slab of patterned stone, every diamond crisp and ordered, and reasonably concluding that you were looking at the petrified hide of a dragon, when in truth you were holding the bark of a tree that breathed and grew and fell 300 million years ago, leaving behind a pattern so perfect it fooled the best minds who first stumbled upon it. That, too, is worth holding gently in the dark. The trees of this age were so strange that we mistook them, at first, for animals. The leaves that made those scars were themselves unusual, and they have a name worth knowing. They were called microphyls. Long and narrow and grass-like, they attached directly to the trunk and to the branches, and they grew thickly when the tree was young and low, and then, as the tree shot upward, the lower leaves dropped away, leaving the bare patterned column behind and carrying the green crown ever higher. Microphyls, simple, slender, single-veined leaves, nothing like the broad, branching leaves of a modern tree, but enough in their countless millions to do the work that all leaves do, to catch the light, to split the air, to begin leaf by leaf, the quiet, planetary work that this whole story is really about. Now, I told you right at the start the most surprising thing about these trees, and I want to come back to it and let you really feel it, because it changes everything about how they lived and how they died. These were trees held up by their bark. Think about what a modern tree is. When you imagine the trunk of a great oak, you imagine dense, hard wood all the way through, rings within rings, solid timber, and a thin layer of bark on the outside like a coat over a strong body. The strength is on the inside. The wood holds the tree up. The bark is just protection. The scale trees were built in almost exactly the opposite way. Their strength was on the outside. They had a thick, tough, bark-like outer layer, a rind, which scientists call the periderm, and this outer shell did most of the work of holding the enormous trunk upright. And inside that armored shell, where you would expect solid wood, there was something much softer, much more fragile. A relatively spongy interior, threaded through with only a thin strand of the vascular tissue that plumbed water up from the roots to the leaves, so the whole giant, all 30 meters of it, all that mass climbing into the sky, was essentially a column of soft tissue wrapped in a strong skin, a tree held up by its bark. There is something almost tender about that image when you sit with it. We tend to think strength has to be solid, dense, heavy all the way through. But these trees solved the problem of standing tall in a completely different way. They grew a strong shell and trusted it to do the holding, and they kept their insides soft. And that strange architecture is not just a curiosity. It is going to matter enormously a little later when we ask what happened to all of these trees after they died. Because a tree that is mostly a tough, decay-resistant shell, rich in a stubborn molecule we will meet very soon, is a tree that does not rot the way an ordinary log rots. Hold that thought lightly, we will come back to it. For now, just feel the strangeness of the design, soft within, armored without, reaching up into a heavy sky on the strength of its own skin. And the way these trees lived their lives was just as strange as the way they were built. Because a lepidodendron did not grow the way the trees you know grow. The trees outside your window grow a little every year, branching and spreading and thickening, building a wider and wider crown over decades and centuries, and a great oak can stand for hundreds of years, growing slowly all the while. The scale trees did something quite different, something that scientists describe with a word that sounds technical but means something very simple and very poignant. They grew with what is called determinate growth. Here is what that means told plainly. For most of its life, a lepidodendron was not a spreading, branching tree at all. It was a pole, a single, tall, unbranched column shooting straight up, putting all of its energy into one thing, getting taller. No spreading crown, no wide canopy of limbs, just a green pole reaching for the light, climbing and climbing, covered in those diamond scars as it shed its lower leaves and grew on. And then, only at the very end of its life, near the top, near the finish, the tree finally branched. It split into a crown all at once, late, and it produced its means of reproduction, scattered its spores into the swamp air, made the next generation. And then, having branched once and reproduced once, it died. I find that an extraordinary way to live, and a strangely moving one. A life spent almost entirely climbing, single-minded, unbranched, pouring everything into reaching the light, and then right at the end, one burst of branching, one act of reproduction, and the end. Some interpretations of these trees suggest they may have lived fast, growing to their full, towering height in a relatively short span, racing upward, flowering once at the summit of their lives, scattering the future, and falling. A live, fast tree, a tree in a hurry in a forest where slowness was a luxury you could not always afford, because all around you other green poles were climbing too, all of you racing for the same high light. And imagine then what such a forest looked like and felt like. Not the cathedral of broad spreading crowns we picture when we think of an ancient forest. Instead, a dense crowd of tall, bare poles, columns of patterned bark rising close together out of the black water, each crowned far overhead with its tuft of slender microphyll leaves, and among them, at every stage, the young poles racing up, and the old ones just branched and spent, beginning to lean, beginning to fall. A forest perpetually growing and perpetually dying, the dead poles toppling into the dark water, the new ones already climbing through the gaps. A forest in constant slow motion, falling and rising for 60 million years. And beneath it all, beneath the black water, were the roots. And the roots too had a strangeness all their own, and a name of their own. The roots of the scale trees were not the deep, anchoring taproots you might imagine for such tall trees. They were a special kind of structure that scientists call Sigillaria. And Sigillaria did not plunge straight down. They spread out horizontally, sideways, branching and branching again through the soft, waterlogged peat, large and spongy, reaching out laterally to hold the towering pole steady and to drink in the water and the dissolved nourishment of the swamp. Spreading roots, fanning out through the black, sodden ground, threading the whole forest floor into one continuous tangle of living tissue just beneath the surface of the water. These Sigillaria roots are among the most common fossils we find from the Carboniferous. Wherever these forests grew, the spreading roots wove themselves through the peat, and when the trees were eventually buried and turned to stone, the roots were preserved too in such abundance that they are one of the signature traces of this lost world. Long branching root systems frozen in rock, the underground reach of trees that fell before the first reptile, before the first dinosaur that would not come for another 60 million years before any of it. The roots are still there. We dig them up. We hold 300-million-year-old roots in our hands and read in them the spreading, horizontal, water-drinking strategy of trees that solved the problem of standing tall in a drowned world. And I want you to feel that ground for a moment, because the ground is where this whole story is secretly being decided. Picture the floor of this forest. It is not soil, not the way we know soil. It is peat, black, wet, half-rotted plant matter, layer upon layer of fallen leaves and toppled trunks and shed bark and dead roots, all of it soaking in standing water. The water sits over everything, dark and still and starved of air. And into this black, waterlogged, oxygen-poor muck, the dead trees keep falling. Pole after pole, generation after generation, toppling into the water and sinking into the peat. And here is the quiet hinge of the entire story, the thing I want to leave you with as this first part of our night draws toward its turn. In that black, airless water, the dead trees did not rot away the way dead trees are supposed to. They piled up. They accumulated. They were buried before anything could finish breaking them down, sealed away in the dark, stacked into the ground, layer upon layer, age upon age. And that, though no one in that swamp could possibly have known it, was the beginning of everything that followed. The buried trees, the forest stacking itself into the earth faster than the earth could digest it. Because a dead tree that simply rots gives everything it has back to the world, its carbon, its substance, returned to the air and the water, the books balanced, nothing left over. But a dead tree that is buried, sealed in airless black peat before it can rot, takes something with it into the ground and does not give it back. And what it takes, and what it leaves behind in the air in exchange, would go on to inflate insects into giants, to set the very atmosphere alight, and, 300 million years later, to be dug up and burned by people who would never know they were burning a forest that fell before the world was young. But we are not there yet. We are still in the swamp, in the warm, heavy, dripping dark, beneath the crowded poles of the scale trees, with the black water at our feet and the diamond-patterned trunks rising all around us into a hazy sky. The dead trees are falling one by one into the peat. The roots are spreading, silent beneath the water, and something stubborn inside those trunks, a molecule the world had not yet learned how to break, is about to become the most important thing on the planet. Let that thought rest for now. Let the forest stand around you, tall and strange and quietly dying and quietly rising, held up by its own bark, reaching for a light it raced its whole short life to reach. Let the black water be still. Let the diamond patterns climb into the dark. We will follow the buried carbon down into the ground, and we will find out what it did to the air very soon. But not yet. For now, just breathe and stay here a little longer, in the oldest forest, where the trees were giants, and their children, the ones still living today, are small enough to hold in the palm of your hand. Welcome to Deep Thinkers. Tell me, before we go any deeper, where in the world you are listening from tonight. Lay it in the quiet below when you wake, if you wake at all, and if these slow descents into the old earth help you find your way to sleep, you might press subscribe and let the next one find you. There is no hurry, there is only the swamp and the warm dark and the long, slow walk down through 300 million years that we have only just begun. So let us go back properly to the beginning of these trees and stand at the foot of one of them. Imagine you are there. You tilt your head back and you keep tilting it. And the trunk goes up and up past where a normal tree would have ended, past where the canopy should be, on into the haze. 30 meters, easily. Taller than a 6-story building, the tallest of them, by some estimates, climbing toward 50. And the trunk at your feet is more than a meter across, wider than your outstretched arms. You would call it a tree. You would be wrong in almost every way that matters, because this was not a tree as you know a tree. It had a name we have given it long after it was gone, Lepidodendron and its cousin Sigillaria. And the family it belonged to was not the family of oaks or pines or anything that shades a street today. It was a lycophyte, a club moss, the giant, towering, ancient relative of a plant you could now step over without noticing, a plant that creeps along the floor of a damp wood and rarely rises higher than your ankle. The whole lineage has shrunk to almost nothing, but here, in the Carboniferous swamp, the club mosses were the forest. They were the giants, and the little green things creeping at our feet in the present day are the last small heirs of something that once blotted out the sky. We call them scale trees, and once you have seen the bark, you understand why. The whole trunk is covered top to bottom in a pattern of scars, diamonds, hexagons, row upon row of them climbing the trunk in tidy spirals, each one the size of a thumbnail or larger, each one marking the place where a leaf had once attached and then dropped away as the tree grew. The leaves themselves were long and slender, almost grass-like, called microphyls, and they ran straight off the trunk and the branches, and when they fell, they left these signatures behind. The whole tree was tattooed with the memory of every leaf it had ever shed. And the pattern was so strange, so regular, so unlike ordinary bark, that when the first fossil collectors found these trunks pressed flat in the rock, they did not think they were looking at a tree at all. They thought they had found an animal. The diamond scales looked to their eyes like the skin of some enormous reptile, like the hide of a snake, scaled and ordered and crawling across the stone. They imagined serpents where there had only ever been bark. It is an honest mistake and a beautiful one, and it tells you just how alien these trees really were, that a careful person holding one in their hands could mistake a fallen forest for a fallen beast. But the strangeness goes deeper than the skin. Here is the thing that changes everything, the thing worth holding on to as we go down into the dark. A modern tree stands up because of its wood. The wood is the strength. It is the dense, heavy, fibrous heart of the trunk, and the bark is just a thin coat wrapped around it. These trees were built the other way around. Most of the strength of a scale tree came not from wood, but from a thick, tough, bark-like outer rind, a layer we call periderm, wrapped around the outside like armor. And inside that armor, the trunk was soft, almost hollow in a sense. The interior was spongy and weak, threaded through with only a thin strand of the tissue that carried water and life up the column. They were, to put it plainly, trees held up by their bark. A tower of rind around a soft and yielding core. Lean on one and you might feel the give of it, the strange softness inside the hard shell. They stood 30 meters tall on the strength of their skin, and they lived in a hurry. This is the last piece of who they were, and it is the saddest and the most interesting. A scale tree did not grow the slow, patient, branching way an oak does, spreading wider and fuller across a long century. It grew as a pole, a single unbranched column racing straight up toward the light, putting everything it had into height, into getting tall fast, before anything around it could shade it out. We call this determinate growth. It spent most of its whole life as that bare, leaf-fringed pole, climbing, and then, only near the very end, only when it had reached its full and final height, did it finally branch, splitting at the crown into a spread of limbs. And there, at the top, in one great final effort, it reproduced. And then it died. It branched once, it scattered its spores into the warm air, and it fell. A live, fast life, a tall and narrow life, a single long reach toward the light, followed by one act of making more, and then the long fall into the black water below. Picture that as you drift, a forest of poles, all racing upward, all reaching, most of them still climbing, a few of them crowned and branching at the very top because their time has come, and a few of them already toppling, slow and silent, into the peat, a forest that is always rising and always dying at once, a forest in perpetual motion that from a distance looks perfectly still. And beneath it all, beneath the black water, the roots are doing their quiet work. The scale trees did not have roots the way you might picture roots, a deep, grasping tangle reaching down. They had something we have given its own name, Sigillaria, great spongy branching organs that spread outward, horizontally, sideways, through the waterlogged peat. They did not so much grip the ground as float through it, anchoring and drinking, threading through the soft black muck that the dead trees were steadily building beneath the living ones. These Sigillaria are, even now, among the most common things you can find in carboniferous rock. The whole world down there, the whole floor of the swamp, was laced with them, a slow horizontal web spreading through the peat in the dark, holding up the racing poles above. So that is what stood here. Bark-built giants on spreading floating roots tattooed with the scars of fallen leaves, climbing fast and dying once, the ancestors of plants you could now hold in the palm of your hand. That is the forest, and now let us set it in time so you know exactly how far down we have come. This was the Carboniferous. The name is younger than you might think. It was given in the year 1822 by two men, William Conybeare and William Phillips, who were looking at the great coal-bearing layers of rock beneath Britain and named the whole period for what those rocks contained: Carboniferous, carbon-bearing, coal-bearing. They named it for the coal before anyone fully understood that the coal was the forest, that the black seams under their feet were these very trees, pressed and buried and turned to stone. The period runs in round numbers from 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago, 60 million years of swamp and growth and burial, and it splits into two halves with names of their own: the earlier Mississippian, the later Pennsylvanian. And the world itself, the shape of the land, was nothing you would recognize. The continents had not yet drifted into the familiar map. They were crowding together, fusing, assembling themselves into a single vast supercontinent that we call Pangaea. And Pangaea sat astride the equator, a great belt of land draped right across the warmest line of the planet. That is where the swamps lived. Right there, on the wet, hot, low-lying equatorial flank of the assembling supercontinent, in basins that sank slowly and stayed wet for ages, the scaled trees rose and fell and rose again 300 million years before the first human being would ever stand and tilt their head back to wonder what they were. And it was what they were made of that made all the difference. Not their height, astonishing as that was, not their roots, branching and strange as those were. What mattered, what set in motion everything that followed? The oxygen, the giants, the coal, the smoke above the power stations, was a molecule. A single, extraordinary, almost indestructible molecule woven through every fiber of every trunk, every branch, every fallen log lying half submerged in that black equatorial water. Lignin. The word itself is unremarkable, Latin for wood, but the thing it names is among the most complex and decay-resistant biological molecules that life on this planet has ever produced. To understand what lignin actually is, it helps to think about what wood is for. A tree is, among other things, a problem of engineering. It needs to hold itself upright against gravity and wind, to carry water from roots to canopy, to resist the rot and the insects and the slow dissolution that the wet world is always trying to inflict on anything organic. Lignin is how plants solve those problems. It is woven into the cell walls of wood, braided around the cellulose fibers the way concrete surrounds steel rebar, stiffening and waterproofing and armoring every strand. Without lignin, a tall plant simply cannot exist. It would collapse under its own weight, drink itself dry, and fall apart in an afternoon of rain. The scale trees had lignin in abundance, Lepidodendron had it, Sigillaria had it. Their bark-like periderm, the thick outer rind that held them upright rather than the woody interior that holds up an oak, was dense with it. Their fallen trunks lying across each other in the shallows were full of it. Every fragment of every tree that entered the water and sank into the peat carried this molecule with it, and the molecule was almost completely impervious to the processes that normally return dead organic matter to the soil. This is the thing worth sitting with for a moment. In an ordinary forest, the kind of forest you might walk through today, with leaves and bark and fallen branches, there is a continuous cycle of death and return. A tree dies, it falls, and within years, sometimes within months, an entire community of organisms dismantles it: bacteria, beetles, fungi. The fungi in particular, the great decomposers of the modern world, are extraordinarily capable. The white rot fungi, the group of organisms whose particular chemical talent is the ability to break down lignin, send their threads into dead wood and take it apart molecule by molecule, returning the carbon to the soil, returning the nutrients to the living community, keeping the cycle turning. In a modern forest, death is just a pause before return. Carbon does not stay buried, it goes around. But here, in the Carboniferous swamp, the cycle was broken. And understanding why it was broken is a question that scientists spent decades arguing about, and are in some ways still arguing about today. The older story, the one that settled into the textbooks and stayed there for many years, goes something like this. Lignin was a new invention. The land plants had been evolving rapidly during the Devonian period, which preceded the Carboniferous, developing the structural tools that let them grow tall. Lignin was perhaps the most important of those tools, but evolution is not a coordinated project. The fungi that would eventually learn to break lignin down had not yet caught up. The biological machinery for dismantling this particular molecule had not yet spread through the decomposer community, and so the dead trees fell into the swamps and nothing could rot them. Not properly, not completely. They lay in the warm water, they sank into the peat, and instead of returning to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and water, they stayed. They accumulated, layer upon layer upon layer, dead Lycophytes, building up beneath the waterlogged surface, being pressed by the weight of the layers above them, the carbon locked inside, going nowhere. It is a beautiful story. It has the clean logic of a mechanism that explains everything at once: the coal, the oxygen, the strange biological lag that let the forest run ahead of the decomposers. And for a long time, it was essentially unchallenged. The Carboniferous coal seams were the product of unrotted wood. The reason the wood was unrotted was that the fungi hadn't evolved. Simple, elegant, and extraordinarily consequential. But in 2016, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a paper by Matthew Nelson and his colleagues, looked at the question again, carefully, and found the textbook story wanting. Not wrong exactly, but incomplete in ways that mattered. The fungal lag, Nelson and his team argued, was real, but probably not the whole explanation. It could not by itself account for the sheer scale of the carbon burial, the enormous quantities of organic matter that had made its way into the rock. Something else was needed. Something bigger. And when you look at the geography of the Carboniferous world, the something else becomes apparent. Remember where Pangaea sat, right on the equator. And remember the specific nature of the basins where the coal swamps grew. Vast, low-lying, persistently wet, slowly subsiding. These were not ordinary landscapes. These were tropical lowlands where the water table was essentially at the surface, where the ground never really dried out, where any organic matter that fell into the peat encountered conditions almost immediately hostile to decay. Decomposition, after all, requires oxygen. The organisms that break down dead material, from bacteria to fungi to beetles, need air to work. And in a waterlogged, oxygen-poor, anaerobic swamp, those organisms cannot function. A log that falls into a sufficiently deep, sufficiently wet peat bog does not rot. It simply does not. The chemistry is not there, the oxygen is not there. The Carboniferous equatorial basins were not ordinary swamps. They were places where the land itself was sinking slowly, steadily, keeping pace with the accumulating organic matter, keeping it wet, keeping it buried, keeping it away from the air that might otherwise dismantle it. The tectonics of the assembling Pangaea, the slowly grinding collision of continents, created basin after basin of this kind, and the wet equatorial climate kept them perpetually soaked. Under those conditions, dead plant matter could be buried faster than it could decay, regardless of what the fungi were or were not doing. The geography did the work. The sinking basins did the work. The relentless tropical rainfall did the work. And the fungi, or the absence of them, was at most one factor among several, perhaps not even the largest. The honest answer then, which is the answer worth carrying forward, is partly the fungi and partly the geography. Probably the fungi mattered, probably the slow spread of lignin-digesting organisms played a role in those early millions of years. But the vast basins of the equatorial Pangaea, sinking and wet and airless at depth, were the mechanism that turned a biological curiosity into one of the most dramatic carbon burial events in Earth's entire history. The dead forests fell in and the world swallowed them. Now here is the thing about photosynthesis that is easy to overlook. When a plant grows, when it takes carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil and builds itself into leaves and roots and bark and lignin, it releases oxygen, that is the exchange carbon in, oxygen out. The oxygen comes from the water molecules that the plant splits apart in the course of building itself, and it goes into the air, and under ordinary circumstances, it does not stay there. Under ordinary circumstances, that oxygen comes right back around when the plant dies and rots. Decomposition consumes oxygen. It takes the carbon in the dead plant and combines it again with the oxygen in the air, returning both to where they came from. The cycle is closed. Net oxygen release from a living, growing, dying, rotting forest, approximately zero. But the Carboniferous forests were not rotting, not fully, not fast enough. The carbon was going into the ground, into the peat, into the slowly compressing darkness of the swamp floor, and it was staying there. And every time a dead tree sank below the water table and stayed buried, the oxygen that the tree had released when it grew, the oxygen that should have come back around when the tree decomposed, had nowhere to go. It stayed in the air. It accumulated. There was no corresponding decomposition to take it back. The oxygen that photosynthesis paid for was left over, stranded in the atmosphere with no return route. And this happened not for a year, not for a century, not for 1,000,000 years, but for tens of millions of years. Forest after forest, swamp after swamp, equatorial basin after equatorial basin, carbon going down and oxygen staying up, the slow arithmetic of burial and surplus adding up over geological time into something the planet had never seen before and has not seen since. The atmospheric oxygen level during the Middle and Late Carboniferous and into the early Permian climbed to something in the range of 30 to 35% of the atmosphere. The best-known attempt to track this number through deep time is a geochemical model called GeoCarbSulf, developed by the geochemist Robert Berner, which uses the chemistry of ancient rocks, the ratios of carbon and sulfur isotopes locked into limestone and shale and coal, to work backward toward the atmospheric conditions that produce them. And what GeoCarbSulf shows across multiple refinements is a striking peak, an oxygen spike rising above anything before or after, reaching that range of 30 to 35% somewhere in the period that the forests were at their most productive, when the burial was at its most intense. Today's atmosphere is 21% oxygen. 21% is the number everything alive right now is calibrated to. Your lungs, your blood, the particular pressure at which your body releases and absorbs oxygen, all of it is tuned to 21%. What the Carboniferous swamps were doing steadily over millions of years was pushing that number up. Past 25, past 30, possibly to 35 or beyond, the highest it has ever been in the history of this planet. And that number, that single change in one constituent of the air, was about to change what was possible for every animal that breathed it. But before we come to the animals, there are more players in the swamp worth meeting, because the forest was not only Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, not only the giant Lycophytes with their bark-built trunks and diamond-scarred skin. The edges of the swamps, the waterways, and the slightly drier margins were populated by other plants, other experiments, other kinds of life that were already, in their own quiet way, sketching out the future. Calamides grew at the water's edge and in the shallows between the scale trees and anywhere the light came down through gaps in the canopy. A calamites was a horsetail, a relative, a very much enlarged and amplified relative of the small, spiky, jointed plants called equisetum that still grow today in damp ditches and along stream banks almost anywhere in the temperate world. The modern horsetail is a modest plant, rarely more than a foot or two tall, its segmented stem sectioned like bamboo, its tiny leaves reduced to whorls of thin spikes that circle each node. It is inconspicuous. You could walk past it 100 times without giving it a second thought. Calamites was not inconspicuous. Calamites grew to 10 meters, sometimes more, its thick, segmented trunk rising from the swamp margin in the same jointed, bamboo-like pattern you see in its tiny descendants. Today, the basic design unchanged even as the scale changed enormously. It stood at the edges of the swamp in dense stands, its upper branches spreading in feathery canopies, catching the light above the waterline where the great Lycophyte trunks cast their long shade. It was abundant. It was widespread, and like the Lycophytes, it contributed to the accumulating organic matter, to the slow thickening of the peat, to the carbon that was piling up beneath the wet surface of the world. Its descendants today would fit in your coat pocket. The difference between a calamites and a modern equisetum is a snapshot of what the world did to plant life over 300 million years, and we will return to that later. There were also the chordates. The chordates were something different, something newer in evolutionary terms and in some ways more familiar, because they were early gymnosperms, early seed plants, distant relatives of the conifers that today cover huge tracts of the northern world. Where the Lycophytes needed to release spores in standing water, where the horsetails depended on wet conditions to reproduce, the chordates were beginning to work their way free of that constraint. They were not fully there yet, but they were moving in a direction that would eventually allow their descendants to colonize drier and drier ground, to wait out the seasons, to reproduce without a puddle. They grew on the slightly drier ground, the elevated ridges and the edges of the basins, where the water table dropped far enough to leave the surface exposed. Tall trees with long strap-like leaves and seeds enclosed in simple cones, they represented a kind of bridgehead on the margins, the future waiting quietly at the edges of a world still dominated by the ancient, water-dependent Lycophytes. The swamp itself would have been a dark place in many ways. The canopy of Lepidodendron and Sigillaria overhead was dense enough to filter most of the direct sunlight, so the floor would have been dim, green-tinted light falling through layers of foliage, the air thick and humid and warm and rich with the smell of plant matter in various stages of accumulation. And the floor was deep in that matter, not soil in the sense we mean when we use that word today, not the dark, crumbly, teeming with worms topsoil of a modern forest, but a thick, spongy, waterlogged layer of partially decomposed plant material, leaves and branches and fallen trunks all softening slowly without fully breaking down, the peat building up year by year and decade by decade and century by century, not going anywhere. It is worth trying to imagine what the peat looked like from below, because everything that fell in, every branch that snapped under its own weight, every lepidodendron trunk that completed its one reproductive event and then died and toppled into the shallows, every frond of calamites that drifted down onto the water and settled, was entering a process that would take it somewhere it had never been before and from which it would not return for 300 million years. The upper layers of the peat were still organic, still recognizable as plant material, still in some slow process of partial breakdown. Below that, as the pressure of accumulation increased and the temperature rose slightly with depth, the chemistry began to change, the peat compacted, the water was pressed out, the carbon became more concentrated, the other elements squeezed away. Deeper still, with more time and more pressure, what had been a fallen lepidodendron trunk became something else entirely. Darker, harder, the carbon more and more pure. And so on, through the long process that takes millions of years and ends not in soil or in life, but in coal. We know an extraordinary amount about what went into that peat, more than you might expect, given how old it is. The reason is something called coal balls. Coal balls are mineralized nodules, sometimes the size of a fist, sometimes larger, found embedded within coal seams. They form when groundwater rich in calcium carbonate or other minerals penetrates the peat at an early stage of burial before compaction has destroyed the cellular structure and replaces the plant tissue mineral by mineral, preserving it in 3 dimensions at the cellular level. When a paleobotanist cuts a coal ball open and grinds it thin enough to see through under a microscope, what they see is the interior of a 300 million year old plant, the cells intact, the vascular tissue preserved, the anatomy visible in a detail that would be remarkable if the specimen were 100 years old, let alone 300 million. Through coal balls, scientists have reconstructed the internal anatomy of Lepidodendron, of Sigillaria, of calamites, of dozens of other carboniferous plants, learning not just what their outsides looked like, but how they worked inside, how they moved water, how they built themselves, how their cells were organized. The peat preserved them, the minerals locked them in place, and time left them waiting. The whole swamp, then, was a kind of slow engine. The plants grew, taking carbon dioxide from the air and oxygen from water, building themselves from nothing, breathing out oxygen into the thickening atmosphere. Then they died, and as all things die, some faster than others, the lepidodendron in its single flowering and death sprint, the others more gradually, and fell into the water and sank into the peat and did not come back. Their carbon went down, their oxygen stayed up, and the engine ran on. Decade after decade, century after century, million year after million year, the equatorial swamps of the Pangaean lowlands churned through this cycle, and the atmosphere above them slowly, incrementally, loaded up with oxygen until it held more of it than it had ever held before, more than it would hold again, 30%, and climbing 32, possibly 35, the numbers from the geochemical models rising as the burial continued, and the balance of the global carbon cycle tilted further and further out of what we would call equilibrium. There is a word for the evidence of what this produced in the rock: fusen. It is the technical term for fossil charcoal, for the recognizable black, brittle, sometimes feathery remnants of burned wood that turn up abundantly in carboniferous coal seams. Fusane is, in a sense, the oxygen leaving its signature in stone, because charcoal forms only when something burns, and something burning requires oxygen, and the fact that fusane is common, not rare, not unusual, but genuinely abundant in the coal record, tells us that the Carboniferous forests were burning regularly, extensively. This matters as more than a dramatic detail. Wildfire in a high oxygen atmosphere is a very different thing from wildfire in the air we breathe today. At 21% oxygen, fire is possible but requires specific conditions: dry fuel, an ignition source, enough air movement to sustain combustion. At 30% or above, fire becomes far more difficult to suppress. Experiments and models suggest that at oxygen levels around 35%, even material that is wet, that you might think of as too damp to burn, can ignite and sustain combustion. A damp branch, waterlogged vegetation on the edge of a swamp. In such an atmosphere, a lightning strike, a volcanic spark, anything capable of igniting organic material could start a fire that the moisture content of the fuel could not extinguish. Which means the Carboniferous swamps burned, not constantly, not everywhere at once, but periodically. When the conditions were right, great fires swept through sections of the forest, consuming the canopy and the undergrowth, leaving behind the charred traces that became the fusin in the coal. And those fires, paradoxically, were part of what kept the oxygen from climbing indefinitely. Fire consumes oxygen. A large enough fire, widespread enough, could slow the oxygen accumulation. It may be one of the reasons the oxygen curve leveled off. Not because the burial stopped, but because the oxygen produced was being consumed, partly, by the fires that oxygen itself made more likely. The atmosphere policed itself, in a sense, through combustion. The forest fed the air, and the air periodically set the forest alight, and the cycle ran its course over millions of years at the kind of scales that no individual creature living inside it could possibly perceive. But we are getting ahead of the story because we have not yet arrived at the consequences of all this accumulation, all this buried carbon, all this oxygen loading of the air. That is what the next part of the forest story is about, the world that 35% oxygen made possible, what it allowed to exist, what it inflated almost unrecognizably simply by changing the pressure of a single molecule in the mix of the air. The scale trees were still growing. The Sigillaria roots were still spreading through the peat. The calamites were still standing at the swamp margins, segmented and feathery, in stands so dense they would have looked from above like fields of enormous bamboo. The cordytes were still waiting on their slightly drier ridges, their long strap-like leaves catching the light, their seeds quietly accumulating the evolutionary patience that would eventually let their descendants inherit a drier world. And the air above all of it was changing, thickening with oxygen, becoming something the planet had never breathed before. Consider for a moment what lignin actually is, not in the loose atmospheric sense, but in the precise molecular sense, because precision here is what makes the story work. Lignin is a complex aromatic polymer, a tightly cross-linked lattice of carbon rings and side chains built into the walls of plant cells. It is what makes wood rigid and water-resistant and structurally sound. It is not a simple molecule. It is not one thing at all, really, but a tangled, branching, irregular architecture that varies from species to species and even from one part of a tree to another. And it is, in the language of biochemistry, extraordinarily resistant to decay. To break lignin down, you need a very specific enzymatic toolkit. You need organisms that have evolved the particular molecular machinery, certain peroxidases, certain oxidases, capable of attacking those aromatic rings and pulling the structure apart. That machinery in the Carboniferous was not yet widespread. White rot fungi, the organisms that in a modern forest would colonize a fallen log and reduce it within years to a soft brown crumble, had not yet become a common presence across these ecosystems. The dead trunks fell, the periderm resisted. The lignin-rich tissues sat on the swamp floor, and did not rot in any complete sense. It compacted, it waterlogged, it began, slowly, its long transformation. This is the classic story, the textbook account, the explanation that filled popular science for decades. And it is not wrong exactly, it is just not the whole picture. In 2016, a research team led by Matthew Nelson published a challenge to that consensus in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. What Nelson and his colleagues argued was that the fungal lag hypothesis, while plausible and while capturing something real, could not account for the full scale and pattern of Carboniferous coal accumulation. The distribution of the great coal basins, the timing of their formation, the geography of where the burial happened, none of it mapped neatly onto what you would expect if fungi alone were the controlling variable. Something else was doing significant work. That something else was the planet itself. The supercontinent Pangaea was assembling during the Carboniferous. The land masses that had been scattered were drawing together, and as they did, the equatorial zone, straddling the seam between the gathering continents, became a geography almost uniquely suited to burying organic matter on a massive scale. The terrain was low-lying, it was persistently wet. Vast tropical lowland basins subsided slowly under their own weight and under the weight of the sediment being deposited into them. Plant matter that fell into those basins was not merely resistant to decay in the way that lignin made it resistant, it was also quickly buried under new sediment, pushed below the zone where oxygen could reach, submerged in waterlogged anaerobic swamp conditions that would have slowed or stopped decay even if fully equipped fungi had been standing by with every enzyme they possessed. You cannot rot what you cannot reach. You cannot break down what is sealed from oxygen before the process can begin. So the picture that emerges from the more recent scholarship is something genuinely harder to summarize than the old story, and also more satisfying in its honesty. It was partly the fungi. The absence of widespread white rot capability was a real factor that allowed lignin to accumulate more readily than it would in a modern ecosystem. And it was partly the geography. The unique tectonic and climatic configuration of the Carboniferous, the wet equatorial basins, the subsiding lowlands, the persistently waterlogged, oxygen-poor conditions, drove burial on a scale that the biochemistry alone cannot explain. The fungal gap opened a door. The geography of a colliding supercontinent ensured that door stayed open for a very long time, and that an enormous quantity of carbon walked through it before anything could pull it back. Partly fungi, partly the shape of the world at that particular moment in its history, and the consequence of that burial was simple in its logic and staggering in its scale. Photosynthesis, as a chemical process, takes carbon dioxide from the air and uses the energy of sunlight to build it into organic tissue, releasing oxygen as it does so. Under ordinary circumstances, that oxygen does not accumulate. The organisms that die and decay consume it again in the process of respiration and decomposition. The carbon is oxidized back into carbon dioxide, and the oxygen budget of the atmosphere stays roughly in balance. What the Carboniferous disrupted for tens of millions of years was that balance. When carbon was buried instead of rotted, the oxygen that photosynthesis had released in building that carbon into tissue had no carbon to recombine with. It stayed in the air. It accumulated, and it accumulated, and accumulated across the long pulse of the Carboniferous into the early Permian. Robert Berner, a geochemist at Yale, spent decades building models of how the composition of the atmosphere has changed over geological time. His GeoCarbSulf model, refined through many iterations, estimates the oxygen content of the atmosphere across hundreds of millions of years by tracking the burial rates of organic carbon and sulfur compounds and the weathering processes that return carbon and oxygen to the system. What his models show for the Carboniferous and early Permian is an oxygen curve that rises steeply and reaches a peak that has no parallel in Earth's history before or since, somewhere in the range of 30 to 35% of the atmosphere. Today, oxygen makes up about 21%. In the depths of the Carboniferous and into the Permian, it may have approached or even exceeded 35. This is not a footnote to the period, it is the fact that reorganizes everything else about it. Coal balls give us some of the finest evidence for the world that produced that oxygen. Coal balls are mineralized nodules found within coal seams. Concretions where the chemistry of the swamp water, rich in dissolved minerals, infiltrated plant tissue very early in the burial process and replaced it with calcium carbonate or other minerals before the cells could collapse or deform. The result is extraordinary. Inside a coal ball you can find Carboniferous plant tissue preserved in three-dimensional cellular detail, cell walls intact, cell contents sometimes still in place, in plants that died 300 million years ago. Scientists who section coal balls and study them under a microscope are looking at tissue that is, structurally speaking, almost as clear as a freshly made slide. The internal anatomy of Lepidodendron, the fine structure of Sigillaria's vascular tissue, the way Calamites built its segmented stems from rings of cells. All of this is known not from inference, but from direct physical evidence, preserved in the nodules scattered through the seams of coal that the Carboniferous forests became. And the Calamites themselves deserve a moment of slow attention because they are easy to overlook. They stood at the swamp margins and along the waterways, the horsetails, relatives of the modern equisetum that grows in ditches and disturbed ground today. But Carboniferous Calamites were not the delicate fronds of a ditch plant. They were trees, segmented like enormous bamboo, each internode a ring of tissue separated by a distinct joint. They reached heights of 10 meters and more, their branches spreading in whorls at each node, their spore-bearing cones borne at the tips. They grew quickly in disturbed conditions, colonizing the edges of waterways where the sediment shifted and the ground was unstable, holding the margins of the swamp against the current. They would have looked from a distance like a stand of particularly large and geometrically organized bamboo, except they were ferns in the broad sense, and they bore no seeds, and the world they were growing in was already thick with more oxygen than it would ever hold again. The chordates grew a little apart from the deep swamp, on the slightly elevated ridges and drier margins where the waterlogging was less severe. They were early gymnosperms, seed plants, distant relatives of the conifers, and they bore long strap-shaped leaves, sometimes 60 centimeters in length, that would have made their canopies look from below like a ceiling of flat green ribbons. Their seeds gave them a capability the Lycophytes lacked entirely, the ability to reproduce without standing water, the embryo protected inside a seed coat and provisioned with its own supply of nutrients, ready to wait out a dry season, ready to germinate on land that a spore could never colonize. They were not the dominant trees of the Carboniferous swamp, but they were there, on the edges, patient, accumulating the evolutionary toolkit that would serve their descendants very well when the world eventually changed around them. All of these plants, the Lepidodendron poles, the Stigmaria roots threading through the peat, the Calamites at the water's edge, the chordates on their drier ridges, were contributors to the same vast process. They were photosynthesizing. They were pulling carbon from an atmosphere still far richer in carbon dioxide than our own. They were building it into tissue stiffened with lignin and resistant to decay. And when they died, a significant portion of that tissue was being buried, slowly, incrementally, cyclically, in the subsiding basins of the equatorial Pangaean world, and the oxygen they had released in building themselves was staying in the air. The air was changing. The forests were, in effect, pumping it, not consciously, not purposefully. There is no purpose in a chemical process, no intention in a molecule of lignin resisting an enzyme that has not yet evolved to attack it, but with the inexorable effectiveness of a system that has no reason to stop. And the atmosphere above those swamps was accumulating, degree by degree across the millions of years, towards something the planet had never experienced and would never experience again. And so the air kept changing, degree by degree across spans of time that dwarf any human reckoning. The oxygen content of the atmosphere climbed past anything the planet had held before. The models built to trace this, including the geochemical framework developed by Robert Berner, the GeoCarbSolf model, which reconstructs ancient atmospheric composition from the chemistry of rocks and sediments, suggest that oxygen during the Carboniferous and into the early Permian reached somewhere in the range of 30 to 35% of the atmosphere. Today it sits at 21%. The difference is not small, and the world that a one-third oxygen atmosphere built was, in its way, as alien as the bark-built trees that had created it. One of the first things such an atmosphere does is burn, not metaphorically, literally. When oxygen concentration rises beyond a certain threshold, and the estimates converge somewhere above 35%, even vegetation that is wet, even wood that has been sitting in standing water, can catch and hold a flame. We know this not as a theoretical prediction alone, but as a fact written directly into the coal, woven through the seams embedded in the black, compressed rock that preserves the remnants of the Carboniferous swamps, are thin, pale layers of a substance called fusen. You might recognize it by its common name, charcoal. Fossilized charcoal, the burned residue of ancient wood, scattered through deposits that formed at the heart of what should have been a dripping, steaming, saturated tropical swamp. The swamp burned, not constantly, not everywhere at once, but regularly, seasonally, in the dry spells that punctuated even those wet tropical years. Lightning would have struck, as it has always struck, and the ordinary ignition that in a lower oxygen world would smolder and go out found instead an atmosphere that fed it. The fires would have moved through the undergrowth and the accumulated leaf litter, through the drier margins of the swamp where the chordates stood on their ridges, perhaps in great sweeping curtains of flame that turned columns of lepidodendron trunks to ash before the rains returned. And the ash and charcoal settled into the peat, were buried with everything else, and became the fusane we find now, a signature so consistent across Carboniferous deposits that it has become one of the most reliable proxies for estimating past oxygen levels. More fusane means more frequent fire means richer oxygen. The coal tells the story of the air that made the coal possible. There is something almost self-regulating in this. As oxygen climbed, fires became more intense, more widespread. And fire consumes organic matter rather than burying it. It oxidizes carbon back into carbon dioxide directly, rather than allowing slow burial. So as oxygen rose toward that upper threshold of roughly 35%, the fires that high oxygen enabled would have worked against further accumulation, burning plant material before it could be buried, releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, nudging the system away from its extreme. The ceiling that oxygen approached was, in some sense, enforced by the flames. This is the world the forests built with their long labor, not a gentle world, a world of immense vitality, of towering trees and saturated air, and sudden fire cutting through the green, of rains that returned and swamps that flooded and peat that deepened. A world running on more available oxygen than any living thing on Earth today has ever encountered in its evolutionary history. And in that world, in that excess of available air, certain things that had previously been impossible became not merely possible, but ordinary. Consider how an insect breathes, not with lungs, not with anything resembling a lung. An insect breathes through a network of tubes, the tracheal system. that branches from small openings in the body wall called spiracles, dividing and subdividing into ever finer passages that reach directly into the tissues. At the finest scale, these tubes deliver oxygen by diffusion alone. There is no pump, no heart moving oxygen-rich blood to distant cells. The oxygen simply moves down its concentration gradient, flowing from where it is abundant, the outside air, the wider tube, toward where it is being consumed, the cells burning fuel at the tips of the finest branches. This is an elegant system for a small animal. For a small insect, the distances are short, the diffusion is fast enough, the cells at the body's core are never far from an oxygen source. But diffusion has a fundamental limitation that physics does not negotiate. Its efficiency falls off rapidly with distance. Double the distance an oxygen molecule must travel through a tube, and the time it takes increases by 4. Triple the distance, and the time increases by 9. The relationship is quadratic, not linear, and it is unforgiving. What this means for an insect is that there is a ceiling on size built directly into the physics of breathing. As the body grows larger, the distances the oxygen must travel through the tracheal tubes grow longer. At some point, a point that depends on the concentration of oxygen available in the surrounding air, the diffusion becomes too slow to supply the innermost tissues adequately. The animal cannot, in effect, be any larger than its breathing system can service. The tracheal system is both its respiratory apparatus and, in a very direct sense, its size limit. Raise the oxygen concentration in the surrounding air, and the physics change. Higher oxygen partial pressure means steeper concentration gradients throughout the tracheal network. Oxygen diffuses faster, or, to say the same thing differently, the same diffusion speed that was barely adequate for a small body becomes adequate for a larger one. The ceiling lifts. The animal can grow larger before it hits the limit that physics imposes. This is not a hypothesis that rests only on ancient fossils and inferred atmospheric chemistry. Researchers have tested it directly on living insects. When modern insect species are reared through multiple generations in artificially elevated oxygen atmospheres, chambers, where the oxygen fraction is raised above 21% towards something closer to the Carboniferous levels, some species show measurable increases in body size across generations. The relationship is not always simple and does not scale up without limit even in the experiments, but the directional signal is consistent. More available oxygen, and some of the insects given enough generations, become bigger. The Carboniferous swamps were, in this sense, a continuous rearing experiment running across millions of years, conducted at a scale and duration no laboratory can replicate under conditions no living animal has experienced. The subjects of that experiment were the arthropods, insects, millipede relatives, and their kin, and the result was that some of them reached sizes that have never been matched since, in any world with less oxygen to breathe. The most famous of these giants, at least in the sky, were the griffin flies, not true dragonflies, though they resembled them in the way a related idea resembles a familiar one, close in shape, different in the details of their wing venation and body structure. Their proper order is Meganisoptera, and their most spectacular member was Meganeuropsis permiana, which extended into the early Permian just as the Carboniferous was fading. Fossil impressions of its wings have been measured at roughly 65 to 71 centimeters across, somewhere between 2 and 2.5 feet, tip to tip. The wingspan of a modern red-tailed hawk. The wingspan, in some specimens, of a small barn owl. Hold that image for a moment. A winged insect aloft over the swamp canopy, navigating between the upper branches of the scale trees with a wingspan that a modern observer would associate not with any insect, but with a bird. And this animal was not a rarity, not a freak. It was a functional, successful predator, presumably hunting among and above the canopy, and it persisted across the geological time spans of the Carboniferous and into the Permian. There is a secondary factor that may have made flight possible at this size, beyond the tracheal system argument. Air is a fluid, and its density, maybe the amount of mass packed into each cubic meter, determines how much lift a wing generates per unit of movement. Denser air, more lift. An atmosphere with a higher concentration of oxygen and the correspondingly higher overall pressure that a richer gas mix implies is a somewhat denser atmosphere. Not enormously so, but the difference at the margins of what is aerodynamically possible may have mattered. For an insect at the upper boundary of flight, at the edge of what a wing of that shape and size can achieve in terms of lift, a marginally denser atmosphere may have been the difference between flight and not flight. The forests did not only oxygenate the air for the griffinflies to breathe, they may also have thickened it just enough for the griffinflies to fly. But if the griffinfly is the most visually spectacular product of the carboniferous atmosphere, it is not the largest animal the oxygen surplus built. That distinction belongs to a creature that never flew, that spent its life on the forest floor and along the edges of the swamp, moving through the deep accumulated leaf litter in the shadows beneath the scale trees. Arthropleura. The name belongs to a myriapod, a relative of millipedes and centipedes, belonging to the broader group that includes them both. And in the carboniferous swamps, this lineage produced something that has not been matched by any land invertebrate in any period, before or since. Arthropleura was, at its largest, approximately 2.5 meters long. Some estimates reach slightly higher. The upper end of the range based on fossil material runs to around 2.5 to 2.6 meters. In everyday terms, the length of a large car. Longer, easily, than most of the people who have ever lived are tall, and it was not slender. Estimates of its width at the broadest point of the body reach up to around 50 centimeters. This was not a worm with legs, this was a substantial animal. A wide, segmented, armored creature moving on dozens of legs through the undergrowth, its body flexing in that characteristic millipede ripple as it moved, its upper surface presumably covered in the hardened plates that gave it its name, the name meaning, roughly, jointed plates. In 2021 and 2022, a remarkably complete fossil of Arthropleura was described from Northumberland in northeastern England. Fossil material from this animal had been known for a long time. Track impressions, fragmentary body plates. But the Northumberland specimen provided a more complete picture of the animal's form, confirming the genuinely enormous scale of the largest individuals. The rock it was found in, a block of sandstone that had fallen from a cliff face, had been opened by chance erosion, revealing the segmented remains of an animal that had walked that ground more than 300 million years before. What did it eat? The question matters because there is a narrative that assembles itself almost automatically around an animal of this size. The narrative of the predator, the apex hunter, the thing that other things ran from. It is a natural assumption. Large modern predators tend to be large precisely because they can take large prey, and it is tempting to look at an animal 2.5 meters long and arm it with menace. But the fossil record does not support the predator story for Arthropleura. No mouthparts have been recovered in a form that indicates a predatory function. The gut contents and associated material from well-preserved specimens point toward plant material, toward the accumulated leaf litter and rotting vegetation of the forest floor, rather than toward captured prey. Arthropleura appears to have been, in the ecological language, a detritivore and herbivore, an eater of the dead forest's leavings. It moved through the shadows beneath the scale trees, consuming the fallen lepidodendron leaves, the rotting plant debris, the accumulated organic matter of the swamp floor, and it grew vast on that diet in the same way that a termite mound, collectively, grows vast on the consumption of wood. There is something almost restful in this realization. The largest land invertebrate that has ever lived was not a monster in any useful sense. It was a consumer of fallen leaves, a very large version of the millipedes that still move through garden compost today, processing the dead plant matter of the forest into simpler compounds, participating in the cycling of nutrients through the ecosystem. It was enormous because the oxygen-rich air of the Carboniferous relaxed the physical ceiling on arthropod size, and it filled that expanded space not with predatory ambition, but with a quiet, leaf-eating life. The forests fed it, and then the forest's own dead leaves fed it further. The scale trees that had built the oxygen-rich world with their long labor of burial and photosynthesis also, in their accumulated litter, provided the substrate on which this creature browsed. The whole system was, in a sense, the forest's consequence. The oxygen that allowed Arthropleura to be as large as it was had come from the forests. The food that it ate, the deep organic litter of the swamp floor, had come from the forests. Even the setting it moved through, the shadowed, root-threaded, waterlogged floor of the scale tree swamp, was the forest's creation. Arthropleura was not separate from the Carboniferous forest. It was a thing the forest had made. And there were other lives in that oxygen-rich world, lives that were not arthropods, and whose response to the atmospheric change was different in kind, more tentative, more hedged by other factors. Among them were the vertebrates. The fish-descended, four-limbed animals that had been colonizing land for tens of millions of years before the Carboniferous, pulling themselves from the shallow coastal waters and rivers of the Devonian, gradually becoming less dependent on aquatic life for their daily survival. By the Carboniferous, these animals had diversified into what we now call the early amphibians, not identical to modern frogs and salamanders, but occupying a similar ecological and physiological position. They were animals that could spend much of their lives on land, could breathe air directly, could hunt and move, and compete among the scale trees and horsetails of the swamp. But they retained one fundamental tie to water that they could not break. They had to lay their eggs there. The egg of a fish, or of an amphibian, is a small, vulnerable, essentially naked packet of genetic material and nutrient, surrounded by a jelly-like coating that protects it from mechanical damage, but does not protect it from desiccation. Lay it on dry land, and it dies. The embryo developing inside needs to stay wet, needs the surrounding medium to provide a barrier against the drying air. The egg is, in this sense, an aquatic object even when the animal producing it spends most of its time on land, and this meant that even the most terrestrially capable early amphibians had to return to water to reproduce. They were tethered. Among the fossil-bearing deposits of the Carboniferous in Nova Scotia, Canada, specifically from the famous Joggins fossil cliffs, where the layered ancient sediments have been studied for well over a century, there is a small, slender animal with the name Hylonomus. The name means, approximately, forest dweller, and the date of this animal is around 312 million years ago, placing it squarely within the later Carboniferous. Hylonomus is among the earliest known true reptiles, one of the first confirmed members of the Amniotes, the group that includes all reptiles, birds, and mammals, the lineage that severed the tether to water. What makes an amniot is the egg. The amniot egg encloses the embryo within a set of protective membranes, the amnion, the chorion, the allantois, that together create a self-contained aquatic environment inside a protective shell. The embryo floats in its own private pond. It does not need to be laid in water. It can be laid on dry land, buried in soil, tucked into leaf litter, deposited in crevices in rock or wood, and the embryo inside will develop protected, provisioned, sealed against desiccation, until it is ready to emerge as a miniature version of its parent. Not a larva that must pass through an aquatic phase, but an immediate terrestrial creature, fully formed. This is one of the most consequential evolutionary innovations in the history of animal life. The amniote egg is what freed the vertebrates from water for the purpose of reproduction. It is what allowed the later reptiles to colonize deserts, to move inland, to spread across every environment that water did not reach. It is the prerequisite for every mammal that has ever lived, including every human being. And it appeared, as far as the fossil record is able to tell us, among the forests of the Carboniferous. Hylonomus has been found fossilized inside the hollow stumps of Lepidodendron trees. The scaled trees in death left stumps. The bases of those tall poles, the remains after the upper structure had fallen and rotted or been buried, and sometimes those stumps, hollow and sheltered, became traps for small animals, snails, insects, small vertebrates, drawn inside by the shelter, by the accumulated detritus that made good foraging, and then, perhaps, unable to find their way back out when the stumps hollow, filled with sediment around them. The Lepidodendron stump that sheltered Hylonomus became, inadvertently, its tomb, and its tomb, very carefully excavated from the Joggins Cliffs, preserved the fossil of the animal that had sheltered there. There is a quiet poetry in this. The scaled tree that spent its life building the atmosphere's oxygen content, that died and fell and became part of the peat being slowly buried under the swamp, also provided in its hollow stump the shelter in which the first amniotes were found. Hylonomus carried inside its eggs the solution to the problem that all land-going vertebrates faced, and it curled inside the remnant of the forest that had, through the long work of carbon burial, made the air it breathed. The Carboniferous was not a single, stable world. It persisted for 60 million years, and across those 60 million years it changed in ways that were dramatic by any geological reckoning. And one of the more remarkable of those changes was not happening in the tropics, not in the warm equatorial zone where the coal swamps flourished. It was happening at the far end of the world, at the southern pole in the vast landmass that was then called Gondwana, the assembly of what would eventually become Antarctica, Australia, South America, Africa, and the Indian subcontinent, locked together in the south as Pangaea continued its slow consolidation. Gondwana was cold. The coal swamps were equatorial, wet, and warm, but the world that held those swamps was simultaneously building ice. A glaciation, one of the significant ice ages of deep Earth history, known as the Late Paleozoic Ice Age, was underway across the southern portion of the supercontinent. Glaciers spread and retreated, responding to the slow rhythms of orbital cycles and atmospheric chemistry. Ice sheets covered what is now the Karoo of South Africa, the highlands of South America, the rocks that are now the Australian outback. The world was cold in the south while it sweltered and dripped at the equator, fire in the tropical forests, ice at the pole. The planet was running both extremes simultaneously, and this was not a coincidence. It was a consequence of the same carbon burial that had built the high oxygen world. As the forests buried carbon, carbon dioxide was drawn down from the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is, among other things, a greenhouse gas. When its concentration falls, the atmosphere loses some of its capacity to retain heat, and the planet cools. The cooling was most dramatic where the sun was already weakest, at the poles, and so the glaciation of Gondwana was, in its deep cause, another product of the Carboniferous forest's long labor of burial. The Ice Age did not sit still. The glaciers advanced and retreated in cycles driven by the same astronomical rhythms, the wobble and tilt of Earth's orbit, that drive the ice ages of more recent geological history. And as glaciers advance and retreat, sea levels fall and rise. When ice sheets grow, water is locked up in them and global sea levels drop. When they melt, the water returns and sea levels rise. The coal swamps sat in coastal and near-coastal basins, low-lying areas of the equatorial landmass close to sea level, shaped by the subsidence of the crust beneath them. When sea levels rose, these basins flooded. Salt water, or brackish water, moved in over the peat, killing the swamp vegetation, depositing marine sediments, limestone from the shells of marine organisms, and shale from the fine muds settling in quiet water over the buried plant matter. When sea levels fell again, the sea retreated, the land was exposed, swamp vegetation colonized again, peat began to accumulate again. And this cycle repeated. Over and over, in rhythm with the advance and retreat of the Gondwanan ice sheets, the equatorial swamps flooded and drained and flooded again, each cycle adding another layer to the stratigraphic record, a layer of coal from an interval of peat accumulation, a layer of shale from a flooding event when the swamp lay under shallow sea and fine sediments settled over the buried peat, a layer of limestone from the fully marine phase when organisms with calcium carbonate shells lived in the water above the buried forest. Then another coal, then another shale, then another limestone. These rhythmically repeating sequences are called cyclothems, and they are one of the most distinctive features of Carboniferous rock. In the great coal basins of the eastern United States, in the Appalachian fields, and the Illinois Basin and the coal fields of Pennsylvania that gave the Pennsylvanian subperiod its name, the cyclothems stack up in the rock, layer upon layer, each one a record of a single cycle of glaciation and deglaciation, a single advance and retreat of distant polar ice translated through the medium of sea level into the flooding and exposure of an equatorial swamp. Thousands of miles separated the ice sheet from the swamp, but the ice sheet's pulse determined the swamp's rhythm. The coal we mine from those sequences is not from a single forest or a single burial event. It is from hundreds of cycles of growth and burial, accumulation upon accumulation, each layer of peat compressed and heated by the burial of everything that came after it, transformed first into lignite, the brownish, soft, crumbly early coal with its still visible plant fragments, then into the firmer, blacker bituminous coal, then in the places where geological heat and pressure ran highest, into the dense, lustrous anthracite that burns cleanest and hottest of all. The rock column of the Carboniferous is, in large part, a record of the planet breathing. Inhaling carbon, exhaling oxygen, cycling ice and water and fire across a world held in a delicate and temporary balance. And through all of it, the scale trees stood. Through the floods and the exposures, through the fires that swept the drier margins and the rains that returned to resaturate the peat, through the oxygen's slow climb and the sky's slowly shifting chemistry, Lepidodendron continued its strange life cycle. The unbranched pole spending its years reaching upward, the diamond-scarred trunk thickening at the base, the Sigillaria roots spreading through the black, waterlogged substrate below, until the moment of branching came, the brief, final burst of reproduction at the crown. And then the tree was done, and it fell, and it joined the accumulating record of the forest's long work. The ice age at the pole, the fire at the equator, the giant insects in the oxygen-rich air, the first amniotes in their hollow stumps, the cyclothems building layer on layer in the subsiding basins. All of it was running in parallel, all of it connected to the same deep cause, all of it sustained by the same planetary process that had been building since the first scale trees rose from the shallow coastal swamps of the earlier Carboniferous. The forests were not merely the setting, they were the engine. And the world they had made was unlike anything before and unlike anything that would come after. But it could not last. No engine runs forever without something changing, without the fuel shifting or the conditions that fed it slowly withdrawing, or the world simply moving on into its next configuration. The scale trees had built their world with extraordinary patience and thoroughness over tens of millions of years, and what they had made was real and vast and consequential. But around 305 million years ago, something began to give way, not all at once, not in a single catastrophe that swept the swamps clean in a season or an age. It happened gradually in the way that most of the deepest changes in Earth's history happen, through the slow accumulation of small shifts until the system that depended on certain conditions found that those conditions were no longer reliably there. The climate was drying. The great wet equatorial belt that had sustained the coal swamps for so long, the persistently waterlogged, warm, perpetually humid corridor that stretched across Pangaea's tropical lowlands, began to contract and fragment. The reasons are bound up in the continuing assembly of the supercontinent itself, in the slow drift of land masses that altered ocean circulation and disrupted the moisture patterns that the swamp forests had depended upon. Seasons became more pronounced. Droughts that would once have been brief and local began to persist longer. The water table in some basins fell, the peat dried in places it had never dried before, and the vast, continuous canopy of Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, which had stretched more or less unbroken across enormous stretches of the equatorial lowlands, began to pull apart. This event has a name in the geological record. It is called the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse, and it happened around 305 million years ago in the Pennsylvanian subperiod, when the Carboniferous still had roughly 6 million years left to run. It is one of the very few times in Earth's long history when a major forest biome, a biome that had covered enormous areas and had been functionally stable for millions of years, collapsed into fragments within what is, on geological timescales, a brief interval. The evidence for it is written in the rock. The coal seams and swamp deposits that were continuous in earlier Pennsylvanian strata begin to thin and break apart, to be replaced by red beds and drier sediments, by the signatures of soils that dried out between wet intervals rather than remaining permanently saturated. The forest that had been a machine becomes, in the record, a patchwork. And then the patches grow smaller and the machine slows. The Lycophytes, Lepidodendron and Sigillaria and their relatives, were poorly suited to what was coming. They had evolved for the waterlogged, stable, perpetually humid swamp. Their Stigmaria root systems spread horizontally through saturated peat, absorbing water from a substrate that was essentially never dry. Their reproductive strategy, the determinate growth that spent most of a tree's life as an unbranched pole before the single terminal burst of reproduction, was optimized for a world of stable, wet conditions. A world where you could afford to spend years reaching height before branching because the conditions would still be right when your moment came. A world that began to experience unpredictable drying, to fragment into isolated wet pockets separated by drier ground, was a world that made the Lycophyte strategy increasingly risky. You might spend years growing your pole and then find the water gone before your crown ever opened. And so the scale trees declined. Not everywhere at once. Wet refugia persisted in some basins, and Lepidodendron and its relatives endured in some places well into the later Pennsylvanian. But the dominance they had held, the overwhelming canopy cover that had turned the equatorial lowlands into what we now picture when we think of the coal swamps, that dominance faded. The landscape opened. Light reached the forest floor in places it had not reached for millions of years. And into that opening light came plants that were better prepared for what the world was becoming. Ferns spread across the disturbed ground. They had always been present in the understory, tolerant of shade and moisture, and now they moved into the gaps the Lycophytes left. Seed plants, the chordates and their relatives, the early gymnosperms that had been growing on slightly drier ground at the margins of the deepest swamps, found that the ground was coming to them. Their great advantage was a reproductive strategy uncoupled from standing water. The Lycophytes and the giant horsetails, the calamites that had towered along the swamp margins and waterways, still depended on water for fertilization, as ferns do. The male cells had to swim to the egg, and that swimming required a wet surface or a film of water, the same way it has required water ever since the earliest land plants crept ashore. Seed plants had moved beyond this constraint. The seed enclosed a complete, self-sufficient embryo in a protective package that could remain dormant through dry intervals and germinate when conditions returned. It was a strategy for uncertainty, for a world where the rain might not come on schedule, where the peat might dry in a season. And as the Carboniferous drew toward its close and the Permian approached, the world was becoming, slowly and surely, that kind of uncertain place. The great coal swamps did not vanish all at once. Some persisted into the Permian, laid down their carbon, contributed their layers to the record. But the age of Lycophyte dominance was ending. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse did not kill the scale trees in a single blow. It fragmented their world, isolated their populations, reduced their range, and over the millions of years that followed, the lineage that had built the coal forests shrank in stature and ambition until what remained was almost unrecognizable as the descendants of those giants. Think about what had once stood in those swamps. 30 meters of trunk, some estimates pushing toward 50, a 6-story building made of bark and lignin and patient determinate growth, a trunk over a meter across at the base, covered in those diamond and hexagon leaf scars, the record of every microphyll leaf that had attached and dropped away as the tree climbed. Sigillaria roots spreading out through the black peat in all directions, wide as the tree was tall, anchoring something that was held upright largely by the stiffness of its own outer rind. These were alien trees by any modern measure, not like the oaks and beeches and pines we know, not built on the same structural logic, not even related to any tree we might walk past today. They were the scale trees, the great Lycophytes, the founders and chief architects of the coal forests, and they had dominated the equatorial lowlands of Pangaea for tens of millions of years, and their living descendants are still here. They did not go extinct, the Lycophytes. They endured the Carboniferous rainforest collapse and the drying Permian, and all the deep changes that followed, through the mass extinction at the end of the Permian that killed more than 90% of marine species, through the Triassic and the Jurassic and the Cretaceous and everything since, diminished but surviving, carrying the lineage forward in a form that is almost impossible to reconcile with the giants their ancestors were. You can find them in almost any temperate forest today. They grow along the ground in the shade of the trees that have replaced them, rarely rising more than a few tens of centimeters. They are called club mosses, Lycopodium and their relatives. Small, creeping, ground-hugging plants that most people walk past without a second glance, or step over, or simply step on without noticing. The lineage that once built 30-meter trees, that once held the sky up on scaffolding of bark and lignin, that once paved the floors of equatorial swamps with Sigillaria roots and rained diamond-scarred bark into the peat, now creeps along the forest floor at ankle height, easily overlooked, rarely remarked upon. There is something in that which takes a moment to absorb. Not tragedy, exactly. The club mosses are successful plants well adapted to their niche, under no immediate threat, going about their ancient business with the same quiet efficiency their ancestors brought to the coal swamps. But the scale of the reduction is staggering when you hold the two images together. The 30-meter pole and the ankle-high creeper are members of the same living tradition, the same unbroken lineage, stretching back more than 300 million years. What was once a forest is now a ground cover. The same fate, in a different degree, came to the giant horsetails, calamites, with its segmented bamboo-like trunk and its groves along the swamp margins and waterways, growing to 10 meters and more. It too had its lineage endure, and its descendants are still with us. The modern horsetail, Equisetum, grows in damp ground along ditches and stream banks in disturbed soil, and at the edges of wet places, rarely more than a meter tall. It retains the segmented structure, the jointed stem, the whorls of thin branches at each node. You can see the family resemblance if you know to look. But the ambition is gone, the stature reduced to something manageable and modest. The giant horsetails of the Carboniferous are now the small, inconspicuous things that colonize the margins of country lanes and grow in the wet verges where nothing else much bothers to root. These reductions are worth sitting with for a moment, in the dark, in the quiet, because what they represent is not failure. The lineages survived, and that alone is an extraordinary thing across 300 million years. What they represent is the scale of what was lost in the climate shift at the end of the Carboniferous and in the changes that followed. A world in which Lycophytes could grow to 50 meters required very specific conditions: the persistent saturation, the warm equatorial climate, the subsiding basins that kept the waterlogged substrate from drying out, and, underlying all of it, the lignin-rich dead matter accumulating faster than anything could rot it, the whole system sustained by the accident of chemistry and geography and timing that made the Carboniferous what it was. When those conditions changed, the giants could not follow. They persisted only in reduced form, scaled down to what the New World could support. And the work those giants had done, the carbon they had buried, the oxygen they had freed, the peat they had laid down in layer after layer in the subsiding equatorial basins. That work did not disappear with them. It had been going on for tens of millions of years, and what it had produced was still there, underground, accumulating, compressing, heating, changing slowly in the darkness. Peat is the beginning of the process. The waterlogged, oxygen-poor conditions in the swamp floor that prevented the full decay of plant matter. Those same conditions preserved the organic material, allowed it to accumulate, pressed successive layers down under the weight of the layers above. The earliest stage is peat itself, recognizable as plant matter, brown and fibrous, still bearing the texture of compressed vegetation. Peat forms today in bogs and fens, wherever waterlogged conditions slow decay enough for organic matter to build up faster than it decomposes. You can hold a piece of modern peat and smell the organic richness of it, the dark, wet carbon of half-preserved plant tissue. But peat is only the beginning. Under burial, under more layers of sediment and rock accumulating on top, pressing down with increasing weight, raising temperature with increasing depth, peat changes. It loses water. It compresses. The lighter, more volatile organic compounds slowly escape or transform. What was fibrous and brown becomes darker and denser. This first transition produces lignite, sometimes called brown coal, still bearing faint traces of plant structure, still relatively soft and crumbly, but darker and denser than peat, with a higher carbon content. Lignite burns, though not as well as what comes next. Deeper burial, more pressure, higher temperature, more time. Lignite becomes bituminous coal, the coal most commonly mined and burned in industrial history, the coal of the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States, the coal of the South Wales valleys and the Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire coalfields of Britain, the coal of Germany's Ruhr Basin. Bituminous coal is dense and black, and it burns well enough to have fueled the furnaces and steam engines of 2 centuries of industrial civilization. It still retains some of the volatile compounds that give it a slight smokiness when it burns, the compounds that made the air of Victorian industrial cities heavy and yellow-grey, and deeper still under the greatest pressures and the longest times, bituminous coal becomes anthracite, the most highly metamorphosed form, nearly pure carbon, hard and lustrous, almost metallic in appearance, burning with an almost smokeless, intensely hot flame. Anthracite is relatively rare, formed only where the geological forces were greatest, where the rock above was deepest and the pressure most intense. But it is the end point of the journey that began with a lepidodendron falling into the black peat of a carboniferous swamp 300 and more million years ago. The coal seams of the Appalachian Mountains, running through Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Kentucky and the other Appalachian states, are carboniferous in age. The coal that built the steel industry of Pittsburgh, that heated the homes and powered the railways of the eastern United States through the 19th century and into the 20th, was laid down in swamp forests broadly contemporaneous with the coal forests of Britain and Europe, when Pangaea was still assembled and the equatorial lowlands stretched across what is now both sides of the Atlantic. Britain's coal basins, South Wales, Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, the Scottish coalfields, are carboniferous. The Ruhr Basin of Germany is carboniferous. The same age, the same origin, the great Lycophyte swamps, the buried lignin, the oxygen they freed, the carbon they locked away. What this means, in the plainest terms possible, is that every lump of coal ever mined and burned, every shovelful fed into a steam engine, every ton loaded into a furnace, every rail of iron and bar of steel ever made with that heat, every kilowatt of electrical power ever generated from a coal-fired plant, was made possible by the work of scale trees that lived and died between roughly 359 and 299 million years ago. The fuel of the Industrial Revolution was carboniferous sunlight, the steam that drove the first factories, the locomotives that pulled the first railways, the blast furnaces that made the iron, and the steel that made the physical infrastructure of modern industrial civilization. All of it ran on energy that had been captured by photosynthesis in the swamp forests of the Carboniferous, locked into the carbon of those plants, buried under waterlogged peat, compressed and heated for hundreds of millions of years, and then dug up and set on fire. This is worth holding in mind as an image. The men and women who went down the coal mines of South Wales in the 19th century, working in narrow seams by lamplight, cutting coal with pickaxes and loading it into carts. They were, without knowing it in this sense, harvesting the remains of forests that had stood in tropical swamps on the equator of a world without grass, without flowers, without birds, without mammals, without any animal larger than a cat aside from the giant arthropods of the oxygen-rich air. They were recovering the compressed body of a world that no longer existed in any form recognizable to a modern eye, a world built by plants that had no living relatives of comparable stature, burning sunlight that had last shone on lepidodendron trunks 300 million years before any human ancestor walked the earth. And there is one more thing about that burning which is perhaps the most significant fact in this story when you consider where it leads. Photosynthesis, as we have said, is a transaction. The plant takes carbon dioxide from the air and, using the energy of sunlight, pulls the carbon into its own tissue. The oxygen that was bonded to that carbon, the oxygen that made it carbon dioxide, gets released. This is the oxygen the scale trees freed into the carboniferous atmosphere, the oxygen that climbed toward 35% and made the world of the giant arthropods possible. When carbon is buried, when the plant falls into the waterlogged peat and is preserved rather than decomposed, that oxygen stays free. The burial of carbon is, from the atmosphere's point of view, the release of oxygen, and the carbon stays underground while the oxygen accumulates above. But the transaction runs in reverse. When something burns, when carbon reacts with oxygen in combustion, the carbon and the oxygen reunite. Carbon dioxide is the product. The oxygen goes back into chemical combination with the carbon. And when you burn coal and when you take the carbon that a lepidodendron built into its bark 310 million years ago and combust it in a furnace, you are releasing the carbon dioxide that the tree withdrew from the atmosphere when it was alive. You are undoing the burial. You are reopening the transaction that the waterlogged swamps sealed. The Carboniferous carbon burial happened over tens of millions of years. The forests did their work slowly, steadily, over an enormous span of geological time, drawing down atmospheric carbon and producing the oxygen surplus that was one of the defining features of the age. It was a drawdown of a scale and duration that is difficult to comprehend in human terms. Not centuries, not millennia, but millions upon millions of years of accumulating buried carbon, the patient work of uncountable trees, living and dying in uncountable swamps across a supercontinent's equatorial belt. The reversal has taken roughly 300 years. The Industrial Revolution began in earnest in the late 18th century, and in the 2.5 centuries since, humanity has burned an enormous fraction of the coal that the Carboniferous forests buried over those tens of millions of years. The carbon dioxide that is returning to the atmosphere now, that is measurably changing the chemistry of the air and the ocean and the climate, is in significant part ancient Carboniferous carbon, the worked carbon of scale trees and giant horsetails compressed and locked underground since before the first dinosaur, now released back into the sky in a geological eye blink. There is no moral being laid at the feet of the scale trees here, and no verdict being delivered on any human choice in this moment. These are facts, simply stated, about where the carbon came from and where it is going. But the symmetry of it is worth pausing over in the quiet. The forests buried the carbon slowly and released the oxygen, and the world changed. The furnaces unbury the carbon quickly and consume the oxygen, and the world changes again. The same element, the same molecules, the same causal chain, running forward in the Carboniferous, running in reverse in the centuries since Watt and Newcomen, and the first practical steam engines, the forests breathed in, we breathed out, and the long exhalation has not stopped. There is something else worth setting right before we leave the Carboniferous behind, a small correction to a persistent misunderstanding that tends to blur when people think about coal and prehistoric life. The creatures most commonly associated in the popular imagination with the deep past, the dinosaurs, the great reptiles, the long-necked sauropods and the predatory theropods, had nothing to do with the coal. This is worth saying plainly. Coal is not made from dinosaurs. It was never made from dinosaurs. The Carboniferous ended roughly 299 million years ago. The first dinosaurs did not appear until approximately 230 million years ago, a gap of more than 60 million years between the forests that made the coal and the animals with which coal is most often imaginatively associated. The coal was already ancient and deeply buried before the first dinosaur ever took a step. Coal is made from plants, specifically from the Lycophytes and horsetails and early seed plants of the Carboniferous swamps, from Lepidodendron and Sigillaria and calamites and chordates, from the accumulated vegetable matter of an alien forest ecosystem that preceded the dinosaurs by an enormous margin. The diamonds and hexagons on the fossil bark were not reptile skin, they were leaf scars, and the energy in the coal is the energy of those plants' photosynthesis, stored as carbon for 300 million years. No dinosaur is in there. No creature with a backbone, for that matter, contributed meaningfully to the coal. It is, in the most literal sense, a forest, and that forest, that world it built, that oxygen-rich, fire-prone, giant insect-haunted, ice at the poles and fire at the equator world, is gone now in every significant sense. The Lycophytes that were its engineers are ankle-high creepers. The oxygen that peaked at roughly 35% has settled back to 21%. The giant arthropods that the atmosphere permitted, Arthropleura measuring 2.5 meters, Meganeura and Meganeuropsis permiana spanning 65 to 71 centimeters, the great griffin flies hanging in the oxygen-dense air, are gone with their enabling conditions. The coal they left behind is mostly burned or will be. The carbon dioxide is returning to the sky. The world moves on to its next configuration. But the story itself, the chain of causes and consequences that the carboniferous forest set in motion, is not gone. It is present in every coal seam still in the ground, in every ton of anthracite that still burns with that almost smokeless blue-edged flame, in every club moss still creeping along the forest floor in the shade of trees whose lineage came after. It is present in the changing chemistry of the air and the ocean, where the ancient carbon is slowly returning to the cycle it was removed from. And it is present in the rock itself, in the coal balls that preserve carboniferous plant cells in three-dimensional cellular detail, in the diamond-patterned fossil bark that early collectors once mistook for snakeskin, in the Stigmaria root fossils that mark the floors of coal seams from Appalachia to Yorkshire, in the charcoal, fusain, layered through the coal beds, the fossil evidence that the swamps burned when the oxygen rose too high and wet wood ceased to be reliably wet. The planet has a memory. Not a memory in the sense of anything that knows or feels, but a record, a physical, chemical, stratigraphic record of what happened and when and what it caused. The Carboniferous is written in that record with unusual clarity and depth because what it produced was so durable and so transformative. The carbon is still there, the coal is still there. The oxygen it freed has long since cycled through 10,000 generations of breathing and burning, but the signature of the event is still legible in the geochemical record that Berner's geocarbsulf model reads in the ancient rock chemistry. The story is inscribed in the earth, and we can read it imperfectly, but genuinely, because the plants were thorough, and the burial was deep, and the time was long enough for the evidence to be preserved. Consider for a moment what a club moss does not know. It grows along the floor of a temperate forest somewhere in the northern hemisphere, extending its small branches in the understory shade, going about the business of photosynthesis and reproduction that its lineage has been about since before Lepidodendron stood in the coal swamps. It does not know that it is the reduced descendant of giants. It does not know that its ancestors built the oxygen surplus that made the age of great arthropods possible. It does not know that the coal compressed in the rock beneath the hills above it is the body of those ancestors, or that human beings have spent 2.5 centuries burning that body to run their civilization. It does not know any of this in the sense that knowing requires. It simply grows as it has always grown, in the available light, in the available moisture, following the ancient instructions of its biology with the same fidelity its ancestors brought to the waterlogged swamps of the Carboniferous. There is something in that image that is both humbling and quietly wonderful. The continuity of life across 360 million years, from the first scale trees rising out of the Devonian coastal lowlands into the Carboniferous swamp forests, through the collapse and the fragmentation and the long reduction to the ankle-high Lycopodium still going about its ancient business in the shade of the modern forest, is one of the genuinely astonishing facts about the living world. The lineage did not break, it persisted. Diminished, yes, transformed beyond recognition in stature and ecological role, but carrying forward the same fundamental biology, the same chlorophyll and cell walls and ancient metabolic logic, into a world that has changed almost beyond comprehension in the time since. The equisetum in the ditch by the country road carries the same message. It is there because the horsetail lineage survived everything: the drying of the Carboniferous, the great extinction at the end of the Permian, the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic and all their upheavals, and is still here, still growing in the wet margins of the world, still jointed and segmented in the pattern its giant ancestors established when they grew to 10 meters in the swamp forests. You could crouch by the ditch on a damp autumn morning and look at the small equisetum growing there, and understand, if you chose to, that you are looking at a living relic, not of a dead lineage, but of a lineage that has been continuously present on this earth since before the coal was coal, since before the oxygen peaked, since before Arthropleura crossed the forest floor in the high oxygen air. The world those plants made is gone, but the plants are still here, and the carbon they buried is still here too, or most of it, slowly returning to the sky as the long reversal continues. The Carboniferous forests drew carbon down over millions of years and gave the world a surplus of oxygen that it has not seen before or since. The burning of that buried carbon is returning it in a tiny fraction of the time. These are not separate stories. They are the same story, told across a gap of 300 million years. The forward stroke and the return stroke of the same slow planetary process, the same elements cycling through the same reactions, the same oxygen freed and then consumed, the same carbon buried and then released. The Carboniferous forests are the first chapter. The coal mines and the furnaces and the changing air are a later chapter in the same book. You are breathing the air that those forests made possible, not literally. The oxygen surplus of the Carboniferous has long since been cycled back through the ordinary exchanges of respiration and photosynthesis and decay. But the oxygen in the modern atmosphere, the 21% that sustains you now, is the product of photosynthesis accumulated over the billions of years since life first learned to split water and release the gas. The Carboniferous contributed to that accumulation at a peak of intensity not seen before or since. The air you breathe carries, somewhere in its long history, the work of Lepidodendron. Not directly, not traceably, but as part of the vast and ongoing transaction between life and atmosphere that the Carboniferous forests participated in at their extraordinary, once-in-Earth's history scale. There is something comforting in the dark in thinking about the slowness of all of this. The tens of millions of years the forests took to build their carbon bank, the 300 million years the coal spent underground, changing from peat to lignite to bituminous to anthracite in the darkness, and the pressure and the geological heat. The way the club mosses have been creeping across forest floors since before anything like a human was conceivable, carrying the lineage forward with a kind of patient, unhurried fidelity that makes our fastest industrial centuries look like a breath. The deep time of the Carboniferous is not merely a backdrop, it is part of the story's meaning. Things done slowly and thoroughly at planetary scale leave traces that endure for hundreds of millions of years. Things done quickly can undo them in centuries. The asymmetry is worth knowing. The scale trees are gone. The swamps that held them are pressed into black rock. The oxygen they freed has been breathed in and breathed out by uncountable generations of animals across 300 million years. The giant arthropods that the oxygen made possible have been gone since the oxygen fell back to its ordinary range. The first reptiles that sheltered in the hollow stumps left descendants that eventually became everything with a backbone on the land. The ferns and seed plants that moved into the gaps of the collapsing rainforest eventually gave rise to the forests we have today. The oaks and beeches and pines and flowering trees that replaced, in their own slow way, the alien scale tree canopy. And under all of it, the coal, still there in the seams, in the places it has not yet been mined, in the deep Appalachian beds, in the untouched parts of the coalfields, in the rock beneath the fields and hills that were once equatorial swamps. Billions of tons of buried sunlight, millions of years of patient work by plants that no longer exist in the form that did that work. A record in carbon of a world that the Earth has not repeated, that the current chemistry of the atmosphere and the current range of plant life and the current distribution of continents will not spontaneously reproduce. The Carboniferous happened once. The conditions that made it possible assembled themselves into that particular configuration once, and what they produced was unique, and the coal that came from it is not renewing and will not renew on any time scale that matters to any living thing. Let that settle quietly as the night deepens around you. The forests stood for tens of millions of years in their alien swamps. They did their work with extraordinary thoroughness, changing the chemistry of the air at a scale that no single process before or since has matched. They produced a world strange enough that a millipede could grow to the length of a car, that a dragonfly could spread wings as wide as a hawk's, that even wet wood could catch and burn in the too rich air. And then they declined, and their descendants shrank to ankle height, and the carbon they had buried slowly transformed in the dark, and eventually human hands dug it up and burned it, and the long, slow breath the forests had exhaled is now being drawn back in by the sky. This is the story of those forests told as plainly and slowly as it can be told. Not as a backdrop to the giant insects, not as a prelude to the dinosaurs that came 60 million years later, not as a chapter in the history of human energy, though it is all of those things as well. Told as the story of the plants themselves. Alien trees held up by their own bark, growing on a strategy of bark and lignin and patient, determinate growth in waterlogged tropical swamps at the equator of a supercontinent, burying their own dead in the peat faster than anything had evolved to rot them, freeing oxygen into the air until the air was 1/3 oxygen, the most it has ever been, and then declining, and their carbon persisting, and the world moving on. They were here. They were extraordinary. And the coal they made is still burning. Let the deep thoughts settle, and let yourself sink with them.